Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on the Built Environment Standards and BS 8670 Part 1. I'm Anna Fricker and I'm a Lead Standards Development Manager at BSI. I'm also the Committee Manager for BSI's Technical Committee for Competence in the Built Environment, otherwise known as CPB1. Before we start today's webinar, we have a few housekeeping points to cover. You'll have noticed that this is a listen-only webinar, so you won't be able to unmute yourselves. The webinar is being recorded, so it will be available for you to access later, and it will also be available for anyone else who isn't able to join us today. You do have the opportunity to ask questions via the Q&A function, which you should see on your screen. We've also received some pre-submitted questions, so thank you to everybody who took the time to do this as well. If you do experience any technical difficulties, please submit these via the Q&A function as well, and we will do our best to sort these out as quickly as possible. You will receive a feedback survey when you exit the webinar. Please do fill this in so that we can improve the webinar experience for everyone, and also so that you receive the link to the recording when it is available. This is a CPD recognised webinar, so please do request your feedback via that feedback survey as well. Finally, we have two handouts which are available in the chat. One contains the process for using captions in Chrome, and the other contains further information and links of interest. So moving on to today's agenda, we will hear from several speakers about the work taking place to develop standards for competence and the relationship to wider activity in the sector. I will give a brief introduction, followed by an update on wider sector activity by Daniel Barrowcliff from the BSR, and this will be followed by a presentation from Richard Harrell, the chair of CPB1, about CPB1 and BS 8670 Part 1 in particular. We will then hear from Dennis Davis and Hannah Clark about the development of two new competence standards. There will be a Q&A session after all of our speakers have presented. However, our fourth speaker, Dennis Davis, does have to leave us before 1 o'clock, so there will be a short Q&A opportunity after his presentation as well. So BSI has been involved with the development of competence standards since 2020, and following the publication of Building a Safer Future and the Competence Steering Group's first report, Raising the Bar, we established a programme of work which was sponsored by DLUC to develop a suite of competence standards to help raise competence across the built environment sector. We started work in March 2020 with the formation of a strategy group which had oversight of the entire programme of work, and we also established an advisory group at that time which was responsible for developing BSI Flex 8670. This was followed a year later by the creation of 3 additional steering groups to develop PAS documents for specific roles or functions. At the same time, the technical committee the strategy group transitioned into a technical committee, CPB1, and this committee exists to provide continual oversight and maintenance of the existing competence standards, as well as being responsible for developing new standards for competence. So this is the framework or the suite of standards as they currently exist. Firstly, we have BSI Flex 8670, which is an overarching framework for competence frameworks. And this was developed through an iterative development process, with the final version being published in April 2021. For the last year, a drafting panel has been working on converting the Flex to a British standard, and Richard is going to speak about that a bit more later. PAS 8671, 8672 and 8673 were published in July 2022, and they give requirements for the competence of individual principal designers, individual principal contractors, as well as the competence required to manage safety in residential buildings. So there are three broad strands to BSI's and CPB1's current and future activity. As well as the conversion of the Flex to a British standard, the committee is developing two new standards on the competence of individual fire risk assessors, BS 8674, and those working with construction products, BS 8670 Part 2. And Dennis and Hannah will speak about those more later. At the same time, the committee is involved in discussions about other new standards, including one on the management of competence for organisations, as well as one on competence for sustainability. We also have the two-year systematic review of the PAS documents coming up in July 2024, and at this point a decision will be taken on whether to retain them or revise them as PASs, or if they should be converted to British standards as well. Of course, BSI and CPB1 do not work in isolation, and we look to collaborate, support and align with wider sector activity. And as part of this, we are looking at the possibility of creating a competence communication hub, and we are refining the committee's strategy for the future. And Richard will talk a little bit more about this later. This final slide shows a timeline of the key work that has taken place to date. So you'll see the establishment of the programme itself, the committee, and the publication of the 4 documents so far. You'll also see that there is quite a lot coming up in the next few months and years. We've got the publication of BS 8670 Part 1 in April. It's been slightly delayed. The 2-year review of the PASs in July of this year. And we're also expecting BS 8670 Part 2 and BS 8674 to be available for public comment in the autumn. So I'll now pass over to Dan Barracliff from the Building Safety Regulator, who's going to give an update on the wider sector competence activity. Thank you.
Hi there, and thanks Anna and BSI to inviting me to speak here. And as mentioned, I'm going to give a presentation on the regulatory environment relating to competence and how that might have changed with the introduction of the Building Safety Regulator, and the impact we want that to have on the wider industry and sector competence activity, the impact it might already be having. Next slide, please. So obviously just to start off with the fact that we had the Building Safety Act in 2022, gained royal assent in 2022, and this came off the back of recommendations from Dame Judith Hackett's review, which followed the tragic events at Grenfell. One of the key recommendations in that review was aimed at addressing sort of the poor levels of competence across the whole built environment. And then so that will move forward to be a key activity for the BSR. The Act obviously also introduced a more stringent regulatory regime for building in England. It established the BSR and HSE, and also will establish a new national regulator for construction products. And there's a whole suite of secondary legislation below it, some of which I will touch on in later slides. Next slide, please. Just briefly here in terms of BSR's aims are so robust, proportionate, evidence-led regulatory regime, and part of the reason HSE was chosen to host the BSR is because we have experience in that area. The key one, the second one there, is to promote competence across the industry and regulators. And also at the bottom, we've got re-establish confidence in the system so that residents are safe and feel safe in their homes. And obviously, residents being safe is the most important aspect, but that restoring confidence in the system after that, there's been a now lack of confidence is key, and competence can play a key role there. People feeling that people constructing, designing, maintaining their buildings are competent to do so and can demonstrate their competence is going to be a key aspect in people regaining competence in this system. Next slide, please. And just to think about BSR's functions and split them into functions that cover all buildings in England and HRBs, because there can sometimes be an impression in industry or in the wider public that BSR is focused on higher risk buildings or high rise residential buildings. And it's true that BSR has some specific functions there which are more stringent and put in place review points and stop points for planning, design and construction of buildings, and then some specific regulation of buildings in occupation in terms of delivering safety cases for buildings, registering buildings and so on. But BSR has a series of functions that cover all buildings. These include an oversight function for the standard and the safety of all buildings. Also includes, which I'll talk in more detail in my next slide, but a general duty relating to industry competence, again, across all buildings. And also regulating the building control profession, which is an important aspect of BSR's work. Next slides, please. So if we focus on BSR's competence remit, so yes, again, BSR has a general duty to facilitate an improvement of competence across the built environment. So that's quite broad. It's about providing assistance and encouragement to industry to improve competence and working out methods, guidance, intervention that's needed to do that. This is about competence across the life cycle of a building. That's BSR's remit, design, construction, management and maintenance of building, and the competence of those people carrying out those activities. We'd also like to see an improvement of competence across the supply chain for design and construction, and we'll work with our partner regulators where we need to do that. So the National Product Construction Regulator in OPSS that I mentioned before, will be key that we work with them to make sure that there is competence across the supply chain that includes products. We'll also have a remit, a very specific remit around building control professionals. They must register with us, they must be assessed competence against a framework which we publish and maintain. In our role in terms of facilitating industry competence is to facilitate industry action. Industry will need to show leadership in taking on activities required to improve competence. And we will hear today about some of the work that industry leaders and industry groups and bodies are doing to create industry recognized standards around competence. And we're very supportive of that. That's part of our role to do so. We also have two specific roles, in other roles in terms of competence, regulatory roles. That's being the building control body in higher risk buildings, so enforcing building regulations in those buildings, which include competence requirements, we'll get on to in a second. And also, as I've mentioned before, as a regulator of the building control profession. Next slide, please. And just to touch on the fact that as part of the secondary legislation associated with the Building Safety Act, there were amendments to building regulations which came into force last October, which placed competence requirements on all those carrying out design and building work. And we always say with this that it wasn't that we didn't expect people to be competent before, but that we're now making it explicit in regulations. In order to comply with building regulations, you need to be able to demonstrate your competence. And the language used in the regulations is that individuals must have the right skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. And we might phrase this in a different way to say this should mean that individuals have the ability to undertake responsibilities and to perform activities to a recognised standard on a regular basis. And so we're going to hear more today. What is a recognised standard, and what we might term as an industry recognised standard? How do we develop them and how do we get them in place? The launch today of this BS standard is really important in that process, and the other standards that will be spoken about by the other presenters. BSR is supportive of that, and BSR will look to use these industry recognised standards when considering whether individuals are able to demonstrate their competence. BSR and other building control bodies will look to these standards as a part of investigations, particularly perhaps where assessing a fault where things may be at fault. and tracking back and understanding, is the issue here that someone wasn't competent? Can they demonstrate their competence to us? And how are they doing so? So move on to the next slide, please. So another key part of the Building Safety Act and a key part of building the BSR's competence activity is to set up what's called termed the Industry Competence Committee. This brings in experts from industry to advise both industry and the regulator on competence. And this committee has recently been appointed and formed. These individual experts that sit on it are sitting there, as I said, as individual experts. They're not representing their sector or organisation. They're bringing their expertise in order to advise the regulator and industry and have a role in overseeing industry competence and monitoring industry competence. And in order to do so, they will need to sort of engage with industry to understand what's happening, just to make sure that their decisions are evidence-based. And you'll hear more from the committee, I think, over the next 12 months on that. And a key part of that is linking the Industry Competence Committee to a group that's industry group that's existed before, that was called the Competence Steering Group, is now called the Industry Competence Steering Group, in order to help ICC engage with industry. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, please. So what we have here is a bit of a busy slide, apologies for that, but it shows that we have the 3 statutory advisory committees plus the Competent Persons Forum, which oversees CPS work, but I won't touch on that. The Building Advisory Committee, the Industry Competence Committee, and the Residents Panel. And they all report into BSR, Chief Inspector of Buildings. And for the Industry Competence Committee, what will sit below it is a series of working groups, one of which, as I will mention, will be the Industry Competence Steering Group. And that's important partly because what sits below the Industry Competence Steering Group is a series of sector-led groups that cover different areas of industry. Those sector-led groups have been working since 2018 to develop industry recognised competence frameworks and standards. And in now reporting into the ICC and BSR, this will give the regulator important information on industry activity in this area, important understanding about whether these industry recognised standards and frameworks are being implemented, used, whether there are any other issues the regulator or ICC can give advice and intervene on. And what we want to see, and what was in the Competence Steering Group's recent report, was a national suite of industry recognised competence frameworks and standards, industry owned. And we're supportive of that work, and linking these groups together allows us to directly show that report and, as I said, monitor the work that's happening and understand whether progress is being made. Yeah, so that's that. And if next slide, please. That's one of the final things that I want to touch on, because we're talking a lot there about standards and industry activities, is the importance sort of behaviours and cultures in relation to competence. The Hackett review, talked a lot about competence issues in industry, and said that the issues around competence were about more than a lack of recognised standards. Individual behaviours will affect whether an individual can effectively use the skills they have gained through training, and that is why the regulatory definition of competence now includes behaviours, and some of the standards and frameworks that are being produced by industry also cover these aspects. But also the culture of organisations will affect the contents and environment in which individuals work, and it's really important for us to have some effect on that. Building regulations specifically state that necessary behaviours from individuals include refusing to carry out work that does not comply with building regulations or is beyond their current competence. And a key aspect of that is organisations allowing that to happen, setting a culture in which that can take place. So that's where I'm going to end. It's just important to end on that point around behaviours and culture, because we do think it's important, and it's something else that we will be monitoring as a regulator across industry. So I'm going to, next slide please, which just has a contact detail which will be shared by BSI afterwards if people have questions direct to BSR on competence or regulations. And now I'm going to hand over to Richard Harrell.
Thank you very much, Dan. Perfectly on time. Excellent stuff. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, indeed. I'm Richard Harrell. I was the technical author for Flex 8670 and its conversion now into BS 8670 Part 1. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk firstly about the work of CPB1. I'm chair of CPB1 and have been since January last year. And CPB1 is a committee devoted to looking at competence in the built environment and a new area of standardization that has the potential to support industry to make the necessary culture change and practical changes to deliver safety and performance throughout the built environment. Next slide, please. Anna mentioned this earlier. CPB1 emerged from the work that was undertaken by what was known as Working Group 0 of the Competence Steering Group. So this was a group of key stakeholders involved in competence work, looking at what the overall framework for competence standards and standardization should be in the longer term. That looked at the kind of wider landscape, how all of the different elements of standardization and the development of competence standards could be mapped together, and resulted in agreement that a formal group should be set up within BSI, a committee responsible for looking specifically at the standardization of competence standards for the built environment. CPB1 itself is a large committee. It has very wide representation, and I'll talk a bit more about that representation shortly. And it has an initial focus perhaps on building safety issues for very good and clear reasons, but that remit in terms of competence for the built environment extends much more widely to all aspects of competence, and we are now looking at issues such as organizational capability and sustainability. So the scope of CPB1 as specified is that it's responsible to the Standards Policy Committee and Strategy Committee for standardization needs for competence in the built environment. It's responsible for defining, developing and delivering standardization outputs for the competence of those involved in the procurement, design, construction, management and maintenance of buildings, including higher risk buildings as defined under the Building Safety Act. So it has a very important role in helping to provide standardization activities for the most important standards at this stage, but perhaps for a much wider range of industry standards over time. Next slide, please. As I said, it's a large committee. It has a wide range of representation. This builds on the work that was done within CPB, within the Competence Steering Group, which was a very positive, wide-ranging process of collaboration across the whole of the key industry bodies. Something that is now being continued in the Industry Competence Steering Group within the Industry Competence Committee of the BSR, which Dan was speaking about. But that collaboration and willingness to share information is reflected in the structure of CPB1. And as you can see from the list of current representatives within and nominating organisations who help to constitute the committee, it's a very comprehensive range of stakeholders indeed. If organisations believe that they wish to be involved, please contact myself or the Secretary, and we will be in touch to discuss that. Next slide, please. Early on, the work of CPB1 picked up the development of Flex 8670. This was an industry proposal for a benchmarking standard on building safety that was supported by central government and developed through what was then a very new approach to, if you like, the rapid prototyping of standards, the FLEX approach. That involved 2 public consultations and rapidly iterating the drafting of the document with a large working group over the space of 12 months. That was then published in 2021, and it has recently been going through the process of conversion into a British standard. And that British standard is known as 8670 Part 1, because the 8670 reference is starting to become a suite of documents rather than just a standalone document that are found, I think could be considered foundational in terms of setting the baseline parameters for effective standardization of competence in the built environment. Next slide, please. As Anna mentioned, CPB1 also has oversight of the ongoing development of 3 key standards that were brought forward to support the duty holding regime. PAS 8671 relates to the principal designer, responsible for coordination of the design phase of the project to achieve compliance with building regulations. PAS 8672 is for the principal contractor, leading on the coordination of construction phase of compliance with building regulations. And PAS 8673, originally developed to cover the building safety manager role, covers building safety management, which is the in-occupation phase, and sets those competence requirements. These are really, really important documents. They apply to all types of buildings in terms of 8671 and 8672, because the duty holding regime applies to all buildings, not just high-risk buildings, but clearly they also reflect the additional criteria for competence that are needed for principal designers and principal contractors working on those higher risk buildings within the new regulatory regime. Next slide, please. As will be discussed later, I said that the 8670 is becoming a suite of standards rather than a standalone. So Hannah's going to talk later about BS 8670 Part 2, core criteria for construction product competence. Construction products have and their use and application have an enormously important part to play in delivering buildings that perform and that are safe. That's derived from work undertaken by Working Group 12, and is very, very clear evidence of how an industry-led group can develop an approach to competence and then bring that into the standardization system in an effective way. Next slide, please. Dennis is going to talk after myself on BS 8674, which is a framework for competence of individual fire risk assessors. Again, this work was rooted in one of the working groups, Working Group 4 of the Competence Steering Group, and consolidates fire industry best practice in terms of the competence of individuals undertaking fire risk assessment. As with the construction product standard, it's another really good case study which shows how when sector-led groups come together, build consensus, and then work that up into a standard that is robust and where there is general agreement as to its fitness for purpose, that is a very, very good pathway, a very good case study of how those sector groups can then bring those standards into the standardization system. Next slide, please. CPB1 is also looking at how we can be more strategic in our activities. So I think it's very clear that as an industry, we are at the start of a significant journey in terms of integrating and developing competence standards and making competence management the norm across all aspects of our industry. So it's really important that we look at how BSI and CPB1 in particular can support that integration and accelerate it and make it more effective wherever possible. There are a number of areas that we're looking at, kind of briefly summarised on this slide. So we're looking at how CPB1 can act as a convener to provide greater industry leadership and support wider collaboration. We want to undertake further outreach work so that we engage with people in a way which enables us to be more linked up with other aspects of competence management or training or development outside of our normal standardization activities. So we'll be reaching out to groups like academics and training providers to understand how we can complement what they're doing to the greatest degree. We want to raise awareness of what CPB1 is doing by engaging with external and internal stakeholders more proactively. We want to look very carefully at how we ensure that the residents' voice is consistently represented within the development of standards and within standards themselves. Behavioural competence, Dan touched on this and I'll talk about it a bit more in a moment, is really critical, and we want to look at how that can be consistently mainstreamed within the standards process, and we want to undertake gap analysis looking at opportunities for development of new national competence standards. Next slide, please. In terms of BS 8670 Part 1, I'm just going to run briefly through a recap of what's included in the standard and cover off the kind of very minor changes really that have been made. So next slide, please. BS 8670 Part 1 is built environment core criteria for building safety and competence frameworks, a code of practice. This is an update of the Flex 8670 and a translation into a full British standard. It was out for public comment last year. We received 72 comments and we've taken those through the normal committee process to amend the standard. There are no changes to the overall structure of the standard and only relatively minor changes to the text to improve clarity and address minor shortfalls in completeness where these were addressed. Next slide, please. As with all British standards, it follows a standard format. Section 0 provides an overview in the introduction, explaining the purpose of the standard, background objectives, and a description of what we mean by competence and competence frameworks. It also talks about what's known as the mapping process, which is a key element of how benchmark frameworks work. Section 1 deals with scope, and it's relevant to other sectors and parts of the built environment industries. Section 2, normative references. There are no normative references for B8670 Part 1. It's a principles and actions based standard rather than requiring compliance with other standards. And Section 3 covers off terms and definitions, which we would encourage people to use when developing their own frameworks to help consistency. Next slide, please. 8670 is intended to act as a benchmark to test existing or new frameworks. So it's not intended to be applied to individuals directly, but it is there to try and ensure that frameworks that are developed recognise and address key aspects for building safety competence. We expect all of the other frameworks that are benchmarked against 8670 to be contextualised to reflect the roles or sectors they work in. We don't expect them to all to mimic 8670 directly. We believe that a mapping approach is the best way to use 8670 to identify gaps in competence or areas that are missing within frameworks that have been development or new. And we encourage a comply or explain process in terms of recording those mapping exercises. So if there is divergence or elements of the 8670 standard are not relevant, they should be explained and recorded. Next slide, please. Section 4 covers general criteria for the structure of sector-specific competence frameworks. These are essentially the core building blocks of what we consider to be a well-structured competence framework. Next slide, please. Section 5 covers behavioural competence. As Dan said, this is critical, and that includes looking at a series of statements and requirements around acting ethically, effective leadership and teamwork, managing competence, personal responsibility and duty of care. Next slide, please. And Section 6 covers off the core criteria for building safety in more detail. So Section 6.1 sets out general criteria. Section 6.2 looks at fire safety, fire strategies, legislation, structural safety and public health. Section 6.3 looks at management, including safety critical roles and duties. Section 6.4 looks at knowledge, primarily reflecting requirements to manage the golden thread through the life cycle of the building. And Section 6.5 looks at systems, so buildings as systems, building systems and construction products and materials. Next slide, please. There are also a series of informative annexes intended as primers. They are fairly high level descriptions covering a wide range of issues, including behavioural competence, fire and life safety, structural safety, public health and safety. They are very much intended to help people identify where they fit in to the overall safety picture and to act as primers for people who are less familiar with building safety issues. Next slide, please. That brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm now going to hand over to Dennis Davis, who will talk about fire risk assessment standards.
Thank you, and thank you, Richard and the BSI for the introduction. Can I move on to my first slide? Thanks. So essentially, I think I've jumped one slightly. I'm going to talk about 8674, but really I wanted to set a background. First of all, why this is all needed, how fire risk assessment is now undertaken, and really what should be in 8674, and really where that then takes us in terms of preparation for the future. I think it's important. A lot of people don't realise that this has been around a while. As you can see, the basis of the legislation was 2005, and a common duty on occupied buildings, including domestic buildings. Two very important fires have occurred in the period. The first, Lakenhall House, back in July 2009, which resulted in a review effectively of what had gone before. And then secondly, of course, the Grenfell Tower fire with 72 deaths, which has again altered the perception of the need and importance, I have to say, of fire risk assessment. And to that, I think we could add a fire that occurred 4 days ago in Valencia with a 14-storey building, 10 deaths again in an occupied residential building. The importance really of this point that I want to make is this is a very unregulated area at the moment. Fire risk assessment, although seen as important in all of these inquiries, does not have a regulated, mandated format at the moment. Next slide, please. But that, of course, is the situation as was. Post-Grenfell, and particularly the Phase 1 report, there has already been change in legislation, and particularly the Fire Service Act, which in turn was then transferred through regulation to take account of fire risk assessment directly, and particularly most people have focused on things like fire doors, which on entries to flats and dwellings and common areas, staircases and so on within buildings. But further, there's been amendment, and I just want to concentrate on this for a little while, Section 156 of the Building Safety Act. Next slide, please, which really has come into effect, but does not, in terms of fire risk assessment mandation, become operative. Part 4 of 156 has specific actions about fire risk assessment. And one of those actions is that if you assist someone who is carrying out a fire risk assessment, then you have to be able to demonstrate competence. The impact of that is, for the first time, there will be a need to demonstrate that you are competent in this activity to what is, in effect, a mandated standard. This is because under the fire safety order, the original founding order, as I say, back in 2005, there is provision to issue guidance, statutory guidance under Article 50, which describes what competence really can look like. And the impact of 1564, when it is brought into force, and it's not in force yet, will be to specify exactly how that can be done. The importance then of a standard grows enormously, because for designated, if you like, premises, and the ones likely to be designated initially are no surprise, buildings, residential buildings over 18 metres, probably hospitals and care facilities as well, will require a demonstration of competency. And that really is the area of application that I want to now concentrate on, which is the thing that's brought the industry together. Next slide, please. We've already made quite a point of the work that was done through the competency steering group. And although this slide's a little bit busy, the 3 reports that were issued by the competency steering group, including the last in December, a higher bar, all include recommendations that take us into a different scenario, one that very much reflects what Dan was talking about earlier on, in terms of how competency can be demonstrated by industry moving forward into a different environment, one that relies heavily on a cultural background. The timeline that I've shown there comes out of a higher bar report, but the detail on it, although it cannot be read in the slide, really does show that a great deal of work has been done in the period since that work started back in 2018. Next slide, please. But when I look at fire risk assessment and my own organisation, the Fire Sector Federation, which coordinated industry in this point, a whole series of documentation has been produced by industry with the direct intent of trying to stabilise and professionalise what is in effect an unregulated activity. So that in fact some of the people can go out there and claim they're a fire risk assessor and have no technical knowledge or background. I mean, it's as simple and as dangerous as that. So industry took this very much on board. It first of all wrote an approved code of practice, which was trying to reflect the learning outcomes of the Grenfell phase 1. It also gave further guidance to how you select fire risk assessors and moved on them progressively until most recently it wrote a benchmark standard for fire risk assessors. Next slide, please. That standard in effect argued that fire risk assessors should have third-party assurance. The reason for that, of course, is verification and public assurance, so that the person responsible for selecting and having to carry out the duty of fire risk assessment could actually be sure that the person they were appointing had at least had some external verification. The approved code of practice also included a high level of detail on what were the skills and knowledge, experience and behaviour that would be expected, and also sought to build a wider link into the building control industry. And in fact, we developed with others within the construction sector training programs that are now available to assist people going onto a construction site understand the basis of fire. Having done that, and this is against the background of where we already had a process document called PAS 79, which told you a methodology to carry out a fire risk assessment, we realised the one thing that was missing was a standard, a baseline standard. And it's very difficult to express a competency without having a standard to which you can relate. So we wrote an industry standard about 2 years ago, and it includes 3 levels of attainment, effectively a foundation, an intermediate and advanced stage. And the reality of that, of course, is it allows a career pathway as well as the development of skills and proficiency as you move forward within your experience within the profession. Next slide, please. That in turn drove us towards 8674. And whilst this is a timeline that I put up in front of you, I think it's worth just dwelling for a moment on the scope of what we see as 8674. The scope intended to look at occupied buildings, and that's quite important, where fire risk assessments are required. Now, whilst a great deal of emphasis, a bit like the higher risk buildings, has been placed on residential dwellings for obvious reasons, this includes all workplaces and can therefore start at a corner shop, move through a factory and into a, as we've said, a very large residential building. But fire risk assessment looks primarily at general fire precautions which are defined, and then relies predominantly on a visual inspection of standards, equipment, products that are already in place. It doesn't therefore involve destructive tendencies within the building. In other words, you're not going to take off the outside cladding and examine it in detail. There are other British standards that do that. But what you are expected to do is form a decision, an opinion, as to whether that looks as though, that external wall, for example, looks as though it should be inspected in much greater detail. And the three levels then go on to explain the sorts of buildings, the type of construction, the conventions that you would normally look at. Therefore, the standard does not and will not go into the very detailed areas of things like the competence of the organisation, the roles of the duty holders, which in particular include, for example, liaising with enforcement authorities and residents. It does not include specialised fire engineering or engineering assets that need to be dealt with differently. As I say, it doesn't involve in the detail of examining an external wall, and it certainly doesn't look at very specialised activities such as nuclear, offshore, chemical plant and so on. The process, however, does look at most general fire precautions in most occupied buildings that are made in a conventional way, and most processes, therefore, that are within those buildings. The timeline allows us to move that forward in a progressive way, and hopefully by the summer of this year we will have the public draft. In fact, we have just started the drafting process, and a draft will be ready, hopefully, for public comment before the summer holidays. Next slide, please. That really is the process that we're underway, but the difficulty this leaves us, going back to 1564, is how do we make this working reality? With the guidance that's likely to come in the statutory form of Article 50 of the Fire Service Order, the concentration will go, first of all, towards the highest risk premises. And those, as I've outlined, will be the larger residential or care type facilities. The model that's intended to be used in that case is a UCAS model that operates under 1706-5024 schemes through certification bodies. These will have minimum scheme requirements, but the individual examinations of competency of the fire risk assessors within those schemes will depend on the British standard. That will be the benchmark standard that will apply. Now, although that applies within, as I say, a high risk building, and we have the methodologies I've touched upon, what it doesn't do as a standard is really deal with the transitional period. Most fire risk assessors do not operate in the higher risk areas. Most tend to operate in the intermediate areas. That's because that's where most of the premises are, and there's an awful lot, of course, in the lower levels of risk. So the point we've got to now look at is how do we regulate that process? How can we bring professionalism to it? How can we define competencies for the benefit of RPs, responsible persons? And the way we're looking at that now is through experienced workers that use regulated qualifications, perhaps in the future apprenticeship schemes, but underneath it all in that transition process will be the British standard that's now being drafted. Its value, therefore, and its importance across this particular sector is immense and cannot be overstated. And I do hope that we can move this quite quickly forward. I'm going to pause there and take any questions if there are some. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. So as I mentioned earlier, we'll move to a few questions for Dennis and then let him go. So the first one is, how will the competence of current fire risk assessors be monitored against the new framework?
This is important in the sense of going forward. We've got a few professional bodies, we've got trade bodies, and we expect them to fulfill the role of actually ensuring the continuation of people who meet standards. I mentioned UCAS and I mentioned regulated standard. The role of the professional bodies in meeting those standards will be very, very important. However, Anna, I think the main part of this process will be the simple one of the market economy. Once it becomes known that there is a fire risk assessor standard, it will start to be contracted into all sorts of work. Responsible persons will not appoint people to do their work unless they conform to the standard. So the monitoring of that process through the professional bodies and through market economies will actually drive it forward. And the schemes I've mentioned, for example, do have certification and recertification standards, which are certainly contained within a 4-year envelope. And in some cases, people are actually reviewed on a much more frequent basis, depending on their learning process.
Thank you. We've had through a rather more general question, but perhaps you could answer it as it relates to 8674. How are the institutions or the different institutions expected to carry out competency assessment, and who will they report back to?
One of the activities that we're going through at the moment is we've moved our arrangements from within the industry working group 4, which was touched on by Richard, into a home office working party, which is jointly operated by Home Office and industry, the Fire Sector Federation. The process that we're going through is to formulate a governance group who will give oversight to this process, the very process you're talking about. And within that oversight group will be the principal players. So the institutions that you mentioned, the professional bodies, the trade associations, which have an awful lot to do with the lower sort of risk premises, will form, if you like, a committee with terms of reference, and part of the process that they will undertake will be the oversight. The group that's under UCAS, of course, is already given oversight by UCAS. So the higher risk premises group will actually be subjected to minimum requirements, as I've said, under scheme requirements by UCAS.
Okay, and I think we are running a little bit behind, but just one last question before Hannah's presentation. In the absence of statutory requirements, what can the fire sector be expected to do for the competence standards to be culturally ingrained?
What we're trying to do, as I say, is actually get these standards onto your BSI approach, so that they're fully national standards. As I mentioned, I think the market will drive those forward, and we are expecting our trade bodies, our professional bodies, to drive through this cultural arrangement. Part of the standard includes a code of ethics, and we will be monitoring that process to ensure that the code of ethics is being applied and hence driven into the sector.
Thank you, Dennis. And I'm afraid that's all the questions we do have time for at this time. So we'll move on to Hannah, who's going to be speaking about the new standard for construction product competence. Over to you.
Lovely. Okay, I exist. That's excellent. And hopefully, Sam has been so kind as to provide me with the ability to move these slides. Let's just see if I can do that. Yes, fantastic. Wonderful to be here. My name is Hannah Clark. I am the Digital and Policy Manager at Construction Products Association. I am also the convener for BS 8670-2, Core Criteria for Construction Product Competence. I am also the chair of the Industry Competence Steering Group that we have been speaking about in practically all the other slides, which is fantastic. And I am the chair of Working Group 12, that the development on the white paper that has been brought forward into this standards process on construction product competence. So yes, we're all kind of very joined up and hopefully quite interlinked in this whole process. Let's move on. Why are we putting together this standard? What are we trying to tackle? Well, the reality is that everybody in the industry, built environment, right across the piece, uses construction products or construction product information in one way or the other. We are all connected in that particular action. And we do know that the misuse of construction products can, you know, if it's incorrectly used, sometimes it can just end in some poor performance. But if it's the other outcome on the other extreme is that it can be potentially dangerous or even fatal. So it's very, very important that we have an industry that really understands the implications of using construction products and construction product information correctly. But also, Dan has set out what the BSR is trying to establish, particularly in England, what we are trying to establish across the UK. But is to being able to identify competence right through the supply chain. That's very challenging because there's so many different professions and occupations. However, we can look for common denominators, and one of those common denominators is construction products. It's the linchpin of these various different industries. So if we work competence around this linchpin, then we can speak from one industry to the next about what construction products, what competence can mean in some kind of common terms, as it were. So to that aim, BS 8670-2 is setting out core criteria for construction product competence to enable all of those using construction products or product information throughout its life cycle, that they can demonstrate that they're competent to do so and can demonstrate that competence to others. That's what it's aimed at. It is essentially for framework owners. It's a sister companion to BS 8670. That's what it's really doing. And as has been laid out by Richard earlier, this is based on a white paper that was developed by Working Group 12, Construction Product Competence, under the old Competence Steering Group, now the Industry Competence Steering Group. Why that's really important for you guys is it's available right now. It's here for you to use. The principles within it will remain the same and consistent. We're just developing and making it sure it's even more practical for use, essentially, when we're moving it into the standards format. So I really, really hope that people take this opportunity to go and have a look what this is, because competence is something that the BSR are asking us to deal with right now. So there is no reason to stop. We put this out on purpose so that the industry would have something while we were developing the standard, but also so that we could really understand how people engaged with it. It was at the time written to go with a flex. It should still work with the new British standard, and essentially it's a check. I like to think of it as a glorified checklist for framework owners. So it is exactly the same as BS 8670. It is directed towards people who are creating competence frameworks. So even though it's about the competence of individuals, the standard is aimed at those who are creating the training for those individuals. It is aimed at anyone who is, well, it's for the individuals of anyone who's doing the task of designing, marketing or selling construction products, providing technical support for construction products, specifying construction products or designing with construction products, procuring construction products, handling or installing construction products, supervising, installing or verifying other functions around construction products, exchanging or managing information about construction products, only maintaining or decommissioning construction products. It's not an exhaustive list. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that it's not just about manufacturers, it's not just about specifiers, it's about the entire gambit. And actually the outputs of this competence is likely to stretch the gambit of two regulators, not one, both the building safety regulator and the national regulator for construction products that currently is in shadow form with the OPSS. Both of these regulators are inputting into this development of this standard. Both of these regulators are recognizing the importance of this standard. So essentially, what are the core criteria trying to do? They're trying to essentially set up a language to understand what construction product competence is doing. I think what is so important that Dan brought out in his presentation, it is so key, is to understand what you can do, what you cannot do. And that is absolutely necessary. We must not think of not being able to doing something as a drawback. It is in itself a competence to understand the limits of your competence. So absolutely central to this is to understand when an actor can do something with construction products or when they can't, and for the whole supply chain to be engaged in that language is really, really important. So to do that, we have 5 levels of construction product competence. And they're split into levels of accountability and responsibility. So at level E, you've got somebody who can perform tasks with construction products under supervision or relay information without interpretation, vitally necessary level of competence. An analogy, you walk into a shop, you ask a shop assistant, I'm after some Marmite, and the shop assistant has the competence to recognise and be able to point you out the Marmite. And you might say to the shop assistant, what goes into Marmite? And the shop assistant has the competence to be able to find authorised source of information, looks on the label on the back, reads the ingredients without interpretation. That is the level of competence of level E. Level D, that's somebody being able to propose a construction product for a direct scope of application. What we mean by that is the key word in there is propose. Propose is the most important word. We're not selecting a construction product. You walk into a shop, you say to the shop assistant, I would like a yeast spread for a sandwich. And the shop assistant can say, here is our collection of yeast spreads. These are meant for sandwiches. But I do not have the competence to tell you which yeast spread you should have for this particular sandwich. That is not where my competence lies. No, no, no. You must make the selection if you're going to be the one with the competence to select the construction product. So at level C is the point when you can start making decisions with construction products, but it is limited to a direct scope of application. What do we mean by direct scope of application? We mean a product has been tested for a particular application. Outside of that particular application, that is what we would call the extended scope of application. And for you to use a construction product in the extended scope of application, you may need to do more industry approved calculations, or you might need to decide that there is more testing required. There is more competence required because there is more risk and there's more things to mitigate when you decide how to apply that construction product. And then finally, we have level A, and at level A, you're thinking about what are the organisational rules you have to have in place, what are the approvals for big decisions such as using products in extended scopes of application or bespoke, for example. So that's broadly what these different levels are doing. And all of the different competence levels speak about the same activity. So number one, you've got everybody has to know what is their level of responsibility, accountability, what can you do, what can you not do within that particular arena. And there are a collection of other subjects at every single level that touch upon what are the competences you need. So we've got understanding regulations, standards and specification. How does a product work as part of a system? Warranties and guarantees. So it's trying to be holistic, but remember, it's a checklist. So it's about applicability, exactly the same as 8670. We encourage comply or explain. So to utilize it, very similar to what Dennis was putting out, we are expecting that this will be something where people will be able to say they require the supply chain to be able to demonstrate appropriate construction product competence. Just to be clear, that does not mean that absolutely everybody working with construction products has to be level A. No, it has to be appropriate competence to the task. For this to be practical, we need to have a diversity of competencies which are appropriate to the functions. For manufacturers, you might be able to use this for demonstrating the competence requirements within the code for construction product information. Contractors might use it to demonstrate the competence of their supply chain. It's such a question right now. How do you make sure that your supply chain is appropriate? If you have everybody within there can demonstrate that their construction product competence is appropriate to their interaction with products, you've got half that problem solved. And regulators can use it to assess that the competence to work for us has been verified, for example. So as I say, please do have a look at the white paper. We want you to use it. We want you to read it. We want you to test it. We want you to ask questions. And we want it to get to the point when we're putting out the consultation, which is going to be, pardon me, autumn this year, that you really understand the principles and that you're ready to engage with this public consultation, because it is a new concept and we need this to be as practical as possible, because we need every chance that we can have to make sure that we understand how our supply chain is engaging with competence in the same terms. So anyway, that was all from me. I tried to go through that as quickly as possible, Anna. I appreciate we're behind time, but very happy if anyone wants to contact me. My details are available on the Construction Products or Association website.
Thank you, Hannah. Yes, we do have around 10 minutes for questions, so if everyone can put their cameras on, we'll make a start. We have had quite a few come in and lots of good questions, so we'll try to cover as many as possible. And we'll start off firstly with a question for Richard. What steps should organisations take to implement and comply with BS 8670 Part 1?
Can't hear you, Richard.
There we go. Inevitable. 8670 Part 1 is aimed at framework owners, so people who are drafting or who own and modify and write competence frameworks. So if you are in a sector where you haven't got a competence framework, then perhaps you need to start looking at how you can build consensus and groups to start bringing those frameworks together. But 8670 is then a tool that you can use to check that your framework has the essential components to drive safe outcomes in the work that you undertake. So organisations look at what's going on in your sector, get involved if there's a need to develop standards, use 8670 to make sure that those standards are comprehensive and address the kind of fundamentals of safety.
Thank you, Richard. Hannah, did you want to add anything to that on the when looking at 8672, for example, because that's intended to be used with 8670 Part 1?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would extend that where there is not consensus, that shouldn't be a reason for organisations not to get involved with it, particularly when organisations have the resources in place to be looking at the competences within their organisation, have to do the work of understanding what those competences. This will guide them. Both of these will guide them as well to be able to, as I say, glorified checklist. It's meant to be so that you don't have to start from nothing. That's what these are trying to do. They're tools to help you in that scenario. Obviously, ideally, what we want to do is bring industry into consensus spaces. But the reality is right now is that we've got a big hill to climb. So I would really recommend that wherever possible, learning is shared, because we've all got this task to do, and we've got to make it accessible through the supply chain. There are SMEs, for example, that need access to this stuff. So that's why we need to drive forward consensus as possible. But that shouldn't mean that anyone waits around, because this does set the principles of how you put together this training. So we can look at both 8670 and the at the moment the white paper, but soon it will be 8670-2 to look at how we set those principles for putting together frameworks that are consistently looking at safe outcomes.
Thanks, Hannah. And Dan, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
I mean, just briefly, just to say that, I mean, I think one of the things that said in the Hackett review that was an issue with competence in the industry is that there was a very fragmented approach. What 8670 allows is there to be a consistent process in creating competence frameworks and standards to a sort of robust standard that can then be used to assess competence in an ongoing manner. And yeah, we're supportive of that approach in dealing with those issues in industry.
Thanks, Dan. So the next question is around the competent person schemes, which I know you touched on briefly in your presentation, Dan. How does the panel view the role of the competent person schemes and where they fit under the new Building Safety Act in supporting competency assessment and standards? What role do they play in supporting the HSE's requirements on monitoring competency? And Dan, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah. So it's competent person schemes. I mean, they're a mechanism to allow installers who have been assessed as competent to self-certify that their work complies with regulations. And that function continues even with the introduction of the Building Safety Act and the Building Safety Regulator. The fact that installers need to demonstrate their competence and should be subject to ongoing monitoring as part of the scheme should mean installations achieve the right level of compliance with regulations. That competence is normally assessed against mandatory technical competence, or which are aligned to national occupation standards, and schemes should operate monitoring of members' work to make sure it meets those standards. With those mandatory technical competencies, they're currently under review, in partly in relation to the work we're talking about here today, and in terms of updating competence standards. The responsibility for that review sits within the Technical Policy Division, which was in the Department of Levelling Up, but now sits in BSR. So BSR now has the responsibility for sort of oversight of the scheme and understanding its impact and what needs to change. So I suppose it might seem on the outside like there are very few discussions happening, but internally within BSR, we are working on reviewing those mandatory technical competencies and getting them agreed, and hopefully they'll have an impact in improving competence and an ongoing basis monitoring what's happening with CPS.
And Richard or Hannah, did either of you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think what it could look like is externally that there's lots of things going on and it's all very disparate. But just to be very clear, there is a group which sits under the Industry Competence Steering Group, Working Group 2, which is dealing with installation. I know that they're doing an enormous amount of work to make sure that the outcomes of what Working Group 2 is doing and those competent person schemes are aligned, that they are having those conversations, and they make sure that there's joined up approach and thinking, that we're not seeing a duplication of effort. And I think that's really important in all the work that we're doing, is trying to make sure that wherever there is possible, that we're challenging ourselves to make sure that we're not pointing industry in too many different directions. So that work is ongoing. As I say, everything is under review, but it is something that is very much part of the agenda.
And Richard, did you want to say anything?
I was just going to add, I mean, the basis of the entire direction of travel that we're on is towards an industry where there is a culture of continuous improvement and learning. So the review that's going on of the MTCs and looking at the competent person schemes is something that plays into that. There's obviously areas that can be improved, but that's going to have to become a normal part of a cycle of review for everyone in the industry, not just competent person schemes, but all of the other standards and frameworks that exist, because it is fundamental that context changes, standards change, technology changes. It is a constant cycle of readdressing the fundamentals and the outcomes that we get from these systems. So it's very welcome that the MTC is being reviewed and looked at. That's something that everyone is going to have to do on an ongoing basis to keep their own frameworks and standards up to date.
Thanks, Richard. We are running out of time almost, so just one last question before we have to finish. What about the competencies of clients, especially around risk and their responsibilities and understanding minimum performance levels? And I don't know who wants to take that one first. Hannah, do you have any thoughts, particularly from the ICSG perspective?
I think there's an area that we need to do some development. Now, currently, underneath the Competence Steering Group, we do have one group in building safety management that has been leading on some work where we're bringing clients into the space and dealing with the competence of clients. Now, as our move into the Industry Competence Steering Group, we are currently doing a piece of work which is remapping our system. Who are we covering when we're thinking about competence frameworks? Who's not been brought into the picture that needs to be? Clients, of course, is in that list. So we're probably going to bring that piece of work that has been initiated by the Building Safety Alliance in the building safety management area, bring that up into a higher level, because clearly we need to have a plan and a joined up approach to that. It has not been we've not got anything resolved from that other than the work that the Building Safety Alliance has been pushing forward, and very well, I might say, but it's definitely something that we're going to be engaging with in the future, because of course we need to make sure that we've all got a holistic approach to how we're dealing with this.
Yeah, I suppose just to add to that, in the building regulations amendments I mentioned earlier, there are some important duties placed on clients to be appointing competent people and going through processes to assure themselves that they are appointing competent people and organisations with the right organisational capability. In order to do so intelligently, they probably also need to be competent themselves, and it's an area we are looking at, so we can give further advice on and how we can engage with clients to help them understand that process.
Yeah, I'll just say clients have a fundamental role in determining the outcome of projects and the way that buildings are managed. They do have duties under the Act. They do need to perhaps modify their approach so that they are more involved in managing risk and managing outcomes rather than divesting those risks or delegating responsibility into the supply chain without having the skills necessary to actually understand what the implications are. But it is very complex given the range of clients that there are, ranging from a simple domestic client through to the largest multinational developer or landowner. So the simple answer is yes, we need to ensure that clients have the right understanding and competence to support the rest of the system in delivering safe outcomes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. If we could just move on to the last slide. Yes, thank you. We have had quite a few questions come through, which we haven't got round to, so we will look to collate all of those and answer those where we can. As I mentioned at the start, you will receive a link to the webinar recording when this is available. BS 8670 Part 1 is due to publish in April. It is slightly behind schedule, but you will be notified when it is published. And if you would like to receive notifications about any of the other competence standards being developed, then you can follow these via the standards development portal. And the link to the committee's page on the SDP is available in one of the handouts. What that handout also contains details about 2 BSI webinars that are coming up in the next couple of months. So one on construction products and the other on BS 40104, which is retrofit assessment for domestic properties. And information about those will be available in due course on our website. So it just remains for me to say thank you to all of our speakers today, and thank you to all of you for attending, and we hope to see you at a future event soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.